Not the morning that changed everything. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez never imagined that a routine patrol through the dusty streets of Kandahar would become the defining moment of her military career. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon on that crisp October morning in 2011 when she gathered her team of 12 soldiers for their daily briefing. Maria had been serving in Afghanistan for 8 months. At 28, she was considered one of the most reliable non-commissioned officers in her unit. Her fellow soldiers respected her calm demeanor and quick thinking under pressure. She had grown up in a small town in Texas, where her father taught her to fix cars, and her mother showed her the importance of helping others. These lessons would prove more valuable than she could ever imagine. The mission seemed straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated that a local village elder wanted to meet with coalition forces to discuss insurgent activity in the area. The village, called Kala-e-Fatah, was about 15 kilometers from their base. Maria's team would escort a convoy of humanitarian supplies while also providing security for the meeting. As they prepared their vehicles, Maria noticed something different about her youngest team member, Private Thompson. The 19-year-old from Ohio had been unusually quiet during the morning briefing. When she asked him about it, he mentioned having a bad feeling about the mission. Maria understood these instincts. She had learned to trust her gut feelings during her 3 deployments. But the mission was important, and they had a job to do. The convoy consisted of 3 heavily armored vehicles. Maria rode in the lead vehicle with her driver, Corporal Jackson, and 2 other soldiers. Behind them followed a supply truck carrying medical supplies, food, and clean water for the villagers. The 3rd vehicle brought up the rear with the remaining team members. The journey to Kala-e-Fatah took them through some of the most dangerous terrain in the region. The road was little more than a dirt path that wound between rocky hills and abandoned buildings. Taliban fighters were known to use this area for ambushes, but intelligence reports suggested the route was clear. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. The radio chattered with routine check-ins from base, and Maria kept her eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of trouble. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot potential threats, a skill that had saved her team on multiple occasions. As they approached a narrow valley about halfway to their destination, Maria noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt suggested recent vehicle activity, but intelligence hadn't reported any friendly forces in the area. She immediately radioed the information back to base and ordered her convoy to reduce speed. The valley was the perfect place for an ambush. High ground on both sides provided excellent cover for enemy fighters, while the narrow road left little room for maneuvering. Maria's training kicked in as she studied every rock, every shadow, every potential hiding spot. What she didn't see was the carefully buried improvised explosive device that had been planted in the road 3 days earlier. The bomb, containing over 50 pounds of military-grade explosives, had been positioned exactly where the convoy would have to slow down to navigate a sharp turn. The explosion happened at 0847 hours local time. Maria remembered the exact moment because she had just checked her watch to update their estimated arrival time. 1 second, she was scanning the horizon through her binoculars, and the next second, her world erupted in fire and smoke. The blast lifted their 15-ton vehicle completely off the ground and flipped it end over end. Maria felt herself being thrown around inside the armored cabin like a toy. The sound was deafening, a deep, thunderous roar that seemed to go on forever. Then came the terrible moment of silence as the vehicle crashed back to Earth upside down. When Maria regained consciousness, she immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Pain shot through her entire body, but she forced herself to assess the situation. The vehicle was completely destroyed, its armor plating twisted like paper. Smoke and dust filled the air, making it difficult to breathe or see. Her first thought was for her team. Corporal Jackson, who had been driving, wasn't moving. Private Sanders was trapped under twisted metal, his leg bent at an impossible angle. Only Private Morrison seemed conscious, though blood streamed down his face from a head wound. Maria tried to move and immediately realized the extent of her own injuries. Her left leg was shattered, with bone visible through her torn uniform. Shrapnel had torn through her right shoulder, and she could feel warm blood soaking through her body armor. But the worst injury was to her spine. Every time she tried to sit up, waves of agony shot through her back. Through the ringing in her ears, Maria began to hear something that chilled her blood. Gunfire. The distinctive sound of AK-47 rifles echoed through the valley, mixed with the deeper bark of machine guns. The explosion had been just the beginning. Taliban fighters had been waiting in the hills, and now they were moving in to finish what the bomb had started. Maria forced herself to look outside the shattered vehicle. What she saw made her heart sink. The supply truck had also been hit by the blast and was now burning fiercely. She could see at least 2 of her soldiers lying motionless in the road. The rear vehicle had escaped the initial explosion, but was now taking heavy fire from multiple positions in the hills. The sound of bullets striking metal rang out as the surviving members of her team tried to find cover. Maria could hear Sergeant Williams shouting orders over the radio, but his voice was strained with panic. They were pinned down in a kill zone with nowhere to run. That's when Maria realized something that made her blood run cold. From her position inside the overturned vehicle, she had a clear view up the valley. Moving through the rocks and scattered buildings were dozens of Taliban fighters. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a carefully planned attack involving at least 40 insurgents. Her surviving team members had no idea how many enemies they were facing. They were trying to hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds, and without air support, they would all be dead within the hour. Maria reached for her radio with trembling hands, but the device had been destroyed in the explosion. The vehicle's communication system was also dead, its antenna snapped off and electronics fried. She was completely cut off from her team and from base. As bullets continued to rain down on their position, Maria made a decision that would haunt and inspire her for the rest of her life. Despite her injuries, despite the overwhelming pain, she knew she had to get to the emergency radio in the rear vehicle. It was the only way to call for air support and save her team. The distance to the other vehicle looked impossible. At least 200 meters of open ground lay between her and the radio, and Taliban fighters controlled the high ground on both sides. In her condition, crawling that distance would be like crossing an ocean. But as she watched another of her soldiers fall to enemy fire, Maria knew she had no choice. She began the agonizing process of pulling herself from the wreckage of her vehicle, leaving a trail of blood in the dust behind her. The battle for Kala-e-Fatah had only just begun. 200 meters of hell. The first few meters were the worst. Every movement sent lightning bolts of pain through Maria's shattered leg and damaged spine. She had to bite down on a piece of fabric torn from her uniform to keep from screaming and giving away her position to the Taliban fighters. Using her elbows and her one good leg, Maria began pulling herself across the rocky ground toward the rear vehicle. The surface was littered with sharp stones and hot metal fragments from the explosion. Within minutes, her elbows were torn and bleeding, but she forced herself to keep moving. The sound of gunfire was getting closer. Through the smoke and dust, Maria could see Taliban fighters moving down from the hills. They were advancing in groups, using proper military tactics that suggested they had received professional training. Some carried rocket-propelled grenades, while others moved heavy machine guns into position. Her surviving team members were putting up fierce resistance from behind the damaged rear vehicle, but Maria could tell they were running low on ammunition. Sergeant Williams was still trying to coordinate their defense, but his voice over the damaged radio grew more desperate with each transmission. "Base, this is Bravo 7, Williams shouted into his radio. "We need immediate air support. We're taking heavy fire and have multiple casualties." The response crackled back through static. Bravo 7, we have birds in the air, but they can't engage without proper target designation. You need to provide exact coordinates for the enemy positions. Maria knew the terrible truth. Her team was pinned down and couldn't move to get a clear view of all the Taliban positions. The pilot circling overhead could see the general area of the fight, but military rules required precise targeting information before they could open fire. Without someone to guide them, the air support was useless. As she crawled, Maria began to understand the full scope of the ambush. The Taliban hadn't just planted one bomb, they had created an elaborate killing field. The IED was meant to disable the lead vehicle and trap the convoy in the narrow valley. Then fighters hidden in carefully prepared positions would destroy the remaining vehicles with rocket and machine gun fire. The plan was working perfectly. As Maria watched, a Taliban fighter with an RPG took aim at the rear vehicle where her team was sheltering. The rocket streaked across the valley and exploded just meters away, showering her soldiers with dirt and shrapnel. Private Thompson, the young soldier who had worried about the mission that morning, was thrown backward by the blast. Maria watched in horror as he tried to crawl to safety, his uniform on fire. Sergeant Williams left his covered position to help, exposing himself to enemy fire. That act of courage nearly cost Williams his life. A sniper's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Now her team was down to less than half strength, with their leader wounded and their ammunition running dangerously low. Maria forced herself to move faster. Each meter felt like a mile, and she had to stop frequently to rest and fight off waves of nausea from blood loss. Her vision kept blurring, and she knew she was going into shock. But the sight of her team fighting desperately for their lives gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Halfway to her destination, Maria encountered an obstacle that nearly broke her spirit. A deep drainage ditch ran across her path, carved by years of mountain runoff. The ditch was about 3 meters wide and filled with muddy water mixed with diesel fuel from the damaged vehicles. Looking at the ditch, Maria realized she would have to crawl down one side and up the other, all while maintaining enough strength to continue the journey. In her condition, there was a real possibility that she would drown in the shallow water if she lost consciousness. But turning back wasn't an option. Behind her, she could hear the Taliban fighters getting closer. Their shouts in Pashto echoed off the valley walls as they coordinated their assault. They knew they had the coalition forces trapped, and they were moving in for the kill. Maria slid down into the ditch face first. The cold, oily water was a shock to her system, but it also helped clear her head. She kept her rifle above the water as she half crawled, half swam across the channel. The current tried to pull her downstream, but she fought against it with the last of her strength. Climbing out of the far side was the hardest thing she had ever done. The muddy bank kept crumbling under her hands, and her injured leg was completely useless for pushing. She had to dig her fingers into the earth and pull herself up inch by inch, leaving gouges in the dirt with her fingernails. When she finally reached level ground again, Maria was exhausted and hypothermic. Her clothes were soaked, and she was shivering uncontrollably despite the desert heat. But she was past the halfway point, and the rear vehicle was now clearly visible about 100 meters away. That's when she heard something that filled her with dread. The distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds. The Taliban had brought heavy weapons to the fight, and they were preparing to finish off her team with indirect fire. The first mortar exploded about 50 meters from the rear vehicle, sending up a column of smoke and debris. Her surviving team members scrambled for better cover, but there wasn't much available in the open valley. The second round landed closer, and Maria could see the terror on her soldiers' faces. Sergeant Williams, despite his wounded shoulder, was trying to direct his men to a more defensible position behind some large rocks, but Maria could see what he couldn't. Taliban fighters were already moving to flank that position. In minutes, her team would be surrounded and destroyed. She found new energy from somewhere deep inside and began crawling faster than she had thought possible. Her broken leg dragged uselessly behind her, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. Shrapnel wounds in her shoulder and back reopened. But she ignored the pain and focused on covering the remaining distance. The Taliban fighters were so focused on the main battle that most didn't notice the lone figure crawling across the valley floor. But one sharp-eyed sniper spotted her movement and began taking shots in her direction. Bullets kicked up dust around Maria as she pressed herself flat against the ground. For several terrifying minutes, she had to remain motionless while the sniper searched for her. She could hear him calling to his companions in Pashto, probably describing her location. If they decided to investigate, her journey would end here. But luck was with her. A massive explosion from the main battle drew the sniper's attention away, and Maria was able to resume her crawl. She later learned that one of her team members had managed to take out a Taliban machine gun position with a well-placed grenade, giving the defenders a brief reprieve. As she got closer to the rear vehicle, Maria could see the extent of the damage. The armored truck had taken multiple rocket hits and was burning in several places. Two of her soldiers lay motionless nearby, Private Chen and Corporal Davis, both good men with families waiting for them back home. But inside the vehicle, she could see the emergency radio that represented her team's only hope. The long-range communication device was designed to reach air support directly, bypassing the normal chain of command. If she could get to it and provide target coordinates, the circling aircraft could engage the Taliban positions. The final 50 meters were a nightmare of smoke, fire, and exploding ammunition. Bullets whined overhead as Maria pulled herself around burning debris and twisted metal. Her hands were now so torn and bloody that she could barely grip the ground, but she kept moving through pure force of will. When she finally reached the rear vehicle, Maria discovered one more obstacle. The radio was inside the burning truck, and she would have to crawl through flames and toxic smoke to reach it. The heat was so intense that she could feel her hair beginning to singe. But as another mortar round exploded nearby, killing two more of her soldiers, Maria knew she had come too far to stop now. She took a deep breath, covered her face with what was left of her sleeve, and pulled herself into the burning vehicle. The radio was waiting for her, its green display still glowing despite the destruction all around it. As Maria reached for the handset with trembling fingers, she could hear Sergeant Williams making one last desperate call for help. His voice was weak with pain and exhaustion, but he was still fighting to save his remaining men. In moments, she would either save them all or die trying. The call that saved lives. Inside the burning vehicle, Maria's world had been reduced to a few square feet of twisted metal and flames. The heat was overwhelming, and toxic smoke filled her lungs with every breath. But the radio was working, and she could hear the calm voice of an Air Force controller on the emergency frequency. Any coalition forces, this is Falcon 27. We have close air support standing by and ready to engage. Please provide target coordinates and authentication code. Maria's hands shook as she gripped the radio handset. She had practiced this moment hundreds of times in training, but nothing could have prepared her for doing it while trapped in a burning vehicle with a shattered leg and failing vision from blood loss. Falcon 27, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, she said, surprised by how weak her own voice sounded. I have eyes on multiple enemy positions and need immediate air support, authenticating with code Whiskey 74. The response came back immediately. Rodriguez, good to hear from you. We've been trying to reach your unit for 20 minutes. What's your status down there? Maria forced herself to focus despite the pain and smoke. She could hear the sound of rotor blades overhead. Apache attack helicopters were circling the valley, waiting for permission to engage. But first, she had to give them precise targets. Falcon 27, I count approximately 40 Taliban fighters in prepared positions. Main concentration on the eastern ridge, grid coordinates November Delta 774589. Secondary position on western slope, Grid November Delta 774612. They have mortars and RPGs. Through the smoke and flames, Maria could see the battle raging around her surviving team members. Taliban fighters were advancing from multiple directions, and her soldiers were almost out of ammunition. Private Thompson was trying to help the wounded Sergeant Williams, while the remaining men formed a desperate defensive circle behind some large rocks. Copy your coordinates, Rodriguez. We have visual on the target area. But we need to verify your position before we can engage. Where exactly are you located? This was the moment Maria had been dreading. The emergency radio was in the middle of the battlefield, dangerously close to where the airstrikes would need to hit. If she gave her exact location, the pilots might hesitate to attack for fear of hitting her, but if she lied about her position, she might be caught in her own airstrike. She made the decision that would define her as a soldier and as a human being. Falcon 2-7, I am mobile and clear of the target area. She lied, her voice steady despite the flames licking at her feet. You are cleared hot on all designated targets. Repeat, you are cleared hot. Understood, Rodriguez. Falcon 2-7 is inbound for gun runs. Keep your heads down. Maria held on to the radio as the first Apache helicopter dove toward the eastern ridge. The sound of its 30mm chain gun was like thunder as hundreds of explosive rounds tore into the Taliban positions. She watched through the burning windshield as enemy fighters scattered or fell under the devastating fire. But the Taliban weren't finished. A group of fighters on the western slope had a clear shot at the attacking helicopter with an RPG. Maria saw one of them taking aim at the Apache as it pulled out of its attack run. Falcon 2-7, you have an RPG team at your 6 o'clock. Western Ridge, 200 meters south of my previous coordinates. The pilot's voice crackled back. Thanks for the heads up, Rodriguez. Falcon 2-8 is moving to engage. The second Apache swung around and unleashed a Hellfire missile at the RPG team. The explosion echoed through the valley as the missile struck perfectly, eliminating the threat. But Maria knew there were still more enemy fighters hidden in the rocks and buildings. For the next 15 minutes, Maria served as the eyes and voice of the air support mission. Despite the fire spreading through the vehicle around her, despite the pain from her injuries, she maintained constant communication with the helicopter crews. She called out target after target, guiding the precise strikes that systematically destroyed the Taliban ambush. Falcon 2-7, I have movement in the building complex northwest of my position. Looks like a mortar team setting up on the roof. Copy. Engaging with rockets. The building disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as the Apache's rockets found their mark. Maria felt a grim satisfaction as she watched the Taliban's carefully planned ambush falling apart under the relentless air assault. But the fire in her vehicle was getting worse. Ammunition was cooking off from the heat, and Maria realized she couldn't stay much longer. Her uniform was starting to smolder, and breathing was becoming almost impossible. Falcon 2-7, this is Rodriguez. I need to relay final targets, and then I'm moving to a new position. She gave coordinates for the remaining Taliban positions she could see, then made a desperate decision. Using her arms and her one good leg, Maria pulled herself out of the burning vehicle and back onto the ground. The cool air was a relief after the furnace of the truck, but she was now completely exposed to enemy fire. Several Taliban fighters had spotted her and were shooting in her direction. She crawled behind a large rock with the radio still clutched in her hands. From this new position, she could see that her team was holding on. The airstrikes had broken the Taliban assault, and the surviving insurgents were retreating into the mountains. All Falcon aircraft, this is Rodriguez. Most targets are neutralized. Enemy forces are withdrawing to the north. My team's position is secure. Outstanding work, Rodriguez. Medical evacuation is inbound. Can you mark your position? Maria fumbled for a signal flare from her equipment vest. With trembling hands, she managed to light it and throw it into a clear area away from her team's position. The bright orange smoke would guide the rescue helicopters to her location. As the sound of approaching medevac helicopters filled the air, Maria finally allowed herself to assess her own condition. She had lost a lot of blood, her leg was completely destroyed, and she was going into severe shock. But she was alive, and more importantly, her team was alive. The rescue came just in time. Paramedics found Maria unconscious behind the rock, still clutching the radio that had saved so many lives. They worked frantically to stabilize her condition before loading her onto the helicopter alongside her wounded teammates. The final casualty count was devastating, but could have been much worse. 4 soldiers had died in the initial explosion and firefight, men and women who would never see their families again. But because of Maria's actions, 8 others survived who would have certainly been killed if the Taliban ambush had succeeded. During her long recovery in military hospitals, Maria learned the full scope of what had happened that day. Intelligence reports later revealed that the Taliban had planned the ambush for weeks, hoping to inflict massive casualties on coalition forces. Instead, the precision airstrikes guided by Maria's radio calls had killed or wounded most of the 40 insurgents involved in the attack. The injuries to her leg were so severe that doctors had to amputate below the knee. Shrapnel had damaged several vertebrae in her spine, leaving her with chronic pain that would last for the rest of her life. But Maria considered herself lucky to be alive. More importantly, she was proud of what her team had accomplished. In letters from home, she learned that Private Thompson had recovered from his burns and was planning to re-enlist. Sergeant Williams had received a field promotion and was now training new recruits back in the United States. The other survivors had all returned to duty, each of them carrying forward the lessons they had learned in that valley. Maria herself received the Silver Star for her actions, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. But she always said the real heroes were the pilots who flew into danger to support ground troops, and the soldiers who fought so bravely while she made that desperate crawl to the radio. Years later, when people asked her about that day, Maria would say that she wasn't a hero. She was just a soldier who did her job when her team needed her most. She had crawled 200 meters through hell because that's what the situation required, and she would do it again without hesitation. The village elder they had been going to meet that day eventually did cooperate with coalition forces, providing intelligence that led to the capture of several Taliban commanders. The humanitarian supplies that had been destroyed in the ambush were replaced and delivered safely the following week. But for Maria Rodriguez, the most important outcome was simpler. 8 soldiers went home to their families instead of coming back in flag-draped coffins. For a leader, for a soldier, for a human being, that was worth any price she had to pay. The war in Afghanistan would continue for many more years, with countless acts of courage by men and women on both sides. But in one small valley, on one terrible morning, the actions of one determined soldier with a radio changed everything. Sometimes heroes aren't the ones who charge into battle. Sometimes they're the ones who crawl through hell to call for help when others need it most.